This is one of the talks that for the prospective students that happens every 2 weeks, sometimes more often. The topics we cover are very diverse. Today is more about machine learning, but we have speakers that speak. For example, in 2 weeks we have a talk with from Budu Baduri from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He will be talking about large data in the sense of the geographic information system and how people use large data to help cities develop and how to design. And 24th of April, we have another talk. It's by the founder of OkCupid, one of the founders, Christian Rudder. This is a special talk. It's the Dean's Lecture talk. It's happening on the 24th of April at Maxfield Dorkins 115.
Yes.
So Jeff is going to give, Yaron is going to introduce Jeff, but I wanted to say a few things since he's from University of Washington. Again, from the prospective students, just one thing, it rains a lot in Seattle. We have nice fluffy things here. So I'll let Yaron introduce the speaker.
So it rains a lot in Seattle, but we get several feet of snow here. Portion. Yeah, only this year. So it's a great honor to have Jeff here. So Jeff is a professor at UW, where he's been there since I think 1998. Is that right, Jeff?
99. No, close enough. Plus or minus epsilon.
He was a graduate student at Berkeley. And it's impossible to list all the awards that Jeff has won and still have time for his talk. So I'll just name a few of them. So Jeff received the Career Award, several other awards for his research efforts, several awards for teaching. He recently received the 25-year award for a paper he wrote in grad school on optimization in distributed computing, or supercomputing. And recently, in 2013, he won both the Best Paper Award at ICML, which is the premier machine learning conference, and the Best Paper Award at NIPS, which is the premier machine learning conference. Okay. So on top of that, turns out that Jeff is a talented jazz bass player. And he's played with some remarkable people, many famous jazz people, musicians. So after his talk, you can maybe ask him to jam if he has time after his meetings today. Okay. So if you ever grab and read one of Jeff's papers and you feel like you're listening to jazz, then that's the reason. So for now, we're just going to let Jeff improvise and take the stage right. So, thanks.
And if you ever listen to jazz and feel like you're reading a technical paper, then that's also something that might happen. So thank you very much, Yaron. I mean, thank you very much for the invitation, for Yaron, and also for Pavlos for helping and doing a lot of the organization and making this happen. I'm actually very happy to be here. This is the first time I've given a talk in this room, so I'm very happy to be here. And I'm actually disappointed to be here, on the other hand, because I was hoping that there'd be a lot more snow. I heard that you have snow here, and I was hoping that you wouldn't mind if you had another month of 4 or 5 feet of snow outside. I'm sure none of you would have minded that. So, in any event, so let's get started. So I'm going to talk today about some work that I think has been occupying some of our time for the past couple of years on summarizing large data sets. And I've heard that this is a fairly diverse audience. So this talk will be sort of catered, or at least the attempt is to cater to the diversity that I sort of am expecting to be in this room. But if there's any question at any time, like if you want more details on anything, feel free to interrupt anytime, even now. So, okay, so here's an outline. And so we'll start off with a little bit of philosophy of large data sets and how a paradigm that we've been investigating, namely submodular functions, sort of agrees with the philosophy. And then the rest of the talk will actually be then applying this to a diverse set of different types of large data sets, like, for example, documents, speech data, machine translation data, images of various sorts, and even genomic assays. So that's the outline, and let's get started. So I think probably everybody at this point is aware that data sets, data in general, is big and getting bigger, right? And you've seen many sort of amazing and worrying plots about the size of the future data. Actually, I had this plot for a while, and I always put a particular date on now, but now kept moving forward, so now I've changed it to be more generic. And no matter what time you are, basically the past didn't have that much data, and the future is about to have an enormous torrent of data. And so this has generated a lot of interest in the scientific community for ways of essentially dealing with and strategizing problems on big data. And so in the statistics and machine learning community, this is actually a blessing, because it basically says that now there's enough data, we have enough samples, that our statistical estimates, or equivalently, what we learn, will be reliably learned and reliably estimated, which is great, because in the past, there has only been a dearth of data, which has led to us not being able to learn interesting things. On the other hand, there are sort of computational consequences of large data, and these are consequences associated with computing resources. Since there are only a limited number of computing resources, it's more important than ever to ensure that we as computer scientists are efficient in how we use this data. And this has actually led to a large number of research opportunities to try to develop, or sort of enhance existing strategies in parallel computing and parallel systems computing, and also develop new strategies, in particular ones that are parallel statistical inference or parallel machine learning. In fact, parallelism in machine learning is right now a very, very big sub-area. So this is great. A lot of research opportunities, a lot of possibilities. But it turns out that data is not the only phenomenon to experience bigness. There have been, in the past, instances of phenomena, physical phenomena, that have been seen in the big before. So let's briefly go back a couple of years and do sort of a history of bigness and see what kinds of ideas people have had about bigness in the past. And in fact, let's look a little bit at sort of statistical physics and sort of modeling molecular structures of objects, like, for example, water, and consider water molecules in different perspectives. So if you have, for example, only a small number of water molecules in a vat, say, then they behave in a particular way. They behave in a way that's reasonably modeled by an n-body simulation or an n-body problem. These are basically these models floating around in vacuum, bouncing off of each other. And an n-body simulation is a reasonable way of modeling these things. If, on the other hand, you have maybe 10 to the 26th or 10 to the 27th of those water molecules floating around in a bucket, then they take on very, very different properties. They splish and they splash, and they're best described not by n-body simulations of 10 to the 27th particles, but instead using the rules of fluid dynamics, which are essentially sets of differential equations that describe properties like viscosity and flow, compressibility. And it wouldn't be reasonable computationally to sort of model a bucket of water using an n-body simulation. That would just be foolhardy and not very efficient. And you wouldn't really necessarily learn anything. And then scaling up even further, if you have very large numbers of water molecules distributed throughout the surface of a sphere, like our planet, then you get still new phenomena that occur, like, for example, Hadley cells and weather events where in Boston you have lots of snow, or in Seattle you have no snow, which we didn't have any, by the way, this year. And again, it just wouldn't be right to sort of say, for example, model Hadley cells based on n-body collisions. There's just too many. And it's a much simpler modeling strategy to use these macroscopic modeling paradigms when things get big. So this is true despite the fact that the underlying mechanism, it's the same underlying fundamental simple mechanism, which are these molecular collision events. So this is an instance of bigger is different. So another instance is in neurobiology. So where you have neurons, and when you look at individual neurons, it's fine to model them, based on the behavior of spike trains, or looking at collections, small numbers of hundreds, maybe thousands of neurons, looking at population coding and how individual, very simple signals are encoded based on small numbers of neurons. But when you have a larger number of neurons, different things happen. And this is something that has been known in the neuroscience community for a long time. People have thought that maybe consciousness or intelligence emerges from the collection of neurons, which when you look at only a very small number of, you'd never imagine that something as rich as consciousness would emerge. And there are sciences of consciousness, like psychology, Buddhism. There are many instances of studying consciousness that don't ever pay attention to what's actually happening at the neurobiological level. And then again, the change in scale happens again when you look at a large number of individuals, when you look at societies. And then you have sciences like social choice theory or the wisdom of the crowd. And you have populations. And one would never think, for example, to model, say, like the traffic patterns in New York City based on the behavior of dopamine in a cell. That would be a kind of ludicrous thing to do, although it is the case, again, that it's still the case. Traffic patterns in New York City are as a result of the same electrochemical impulses that are occurring in many, many brains and many, many neurons. So this is not new, this idea. P.W. Anderson, who was a famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, claimed in 1972 in his famous paper that the ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. So that's 1972, but it even goes back even further to the philosopher Hegel, who essentially said that quantity has a quality all of its own. When things get big, things are different. OK, so that is our sort of history of bigness. Now the question is, getting back to big data, does data exhibit different properties when it's very, very large? And that's sort of our running hypothesis, our running idea, is that extremely large data sets offer qualitatively different capabilities than do small data sets. Now, have there been examples of this already? So one just very simple example is it's a paper, actually. It's a very simple paper in the computer vision community by Hayes and Efros, who did the problem of image completion. And the problem is the following. They have an image on the left, and they want to get rid of some piece of it, like this bit here. And so they trace out the piece that they want to get rid of, which is here. And then they have a completed image on the right, which is this bit. Now, how do they do this? It's a very simple algorithm. What they do is they have this collection of images, and they find images that are nearby that sort of have patches that are similar to the region that you want to excise from the original image, and they fill in that with some of the other image. And what they found, which I think is sort of, it's an interesting quotation from this paper, which is sort of, it's probably was a peripheral comment, but I think it's central to the argument that we're making here, is that when they did this very simple algorithm on small image collections, they were very discouraging. They didn't work at all. But when they did exactly the same nearest neighbor algorithm on image collections, using a database of image collections, it was about 2.3 million images. Suddenly, everything started working, and they had a qualitatively different behavior. So this is, I think, an example of what we saw with water molecules and neurons, which is that these macroscopic properties, the algorithm in this case is a very simple algorithm, fails. This algorithm would fail when the data is small. Viscosity fails when you have a small number of water molecules. Consciousness fails when you have only a small number of neurons. The bigger the data becomes, the better it makes possible simpler algorithms to actually work on that big data. So that's the idea. But the problem still remains, which is that this computational problem is we have finite resources. Parallel computing is hard. Unit processor performance isn't getting faster. We have this complexity, this computational complexity challenge, which is that big data means big computation. And that's hard. And so the research quest is the following. Can we make statistical predictions? And can we do actions based on data cost effectively using the right small data? So if we, for example, take the large data set, choose the right small subset of that data in such a way that we've maybe perhaps preserved some of these macroscopic properties, or we've preserved something important about the data so that we can still see that stuff, still see the novelty, the emergent properties, without actually using all of the data. And that's sort of the goal of the whole idea. OK, so that's the motivation. And now I'm going to argue that there's a class of functions, a submodular class of functions, which is sort of reasonable to sort of help us achieve this quest. So this would be a good time for questions if there are any questions. Yeah.
When you compare these examples, water, for example, big data, in water, the qualitative difference because of interaction. Say that in data sets, I think interactions are non-interaction.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that there's a direct analogy between the way that water molecules interact in the big and the way that data items interact in the big. But what seems to be analogous is that when data sets get very, very large, it's possible to get by with simpler algorithms. And the simpler algorithms are sort of analogous to the sort of macroscopic theories. Like for example, the nearest neighbor would be the analogy to psychology, if you're talking about neurons. Or it would be analogous to fluid dynamics in the case of water molecules. But if you were to run, let's say you only had this 10,000 image set, say, for doing the image completion, that simple algorithm doesn't work. But one could potentially think about a much richer algorithm that sort of parses, does 3D reconstruction of the images and say, OK, this is a tree, and this is an ocean, and this is a boat, and looks at all of the images and doesn't sort of naively sort of take patches of the image and glue them together. So it's a fairly naive algorithm, this nearest neighbor thing. But it only works when the data set gets large enough. So the question is that as data scales to larger and larger sizes, which would be a great thing if it's true, right? As data gets to larger and larger sizes, can we get by with simpler and simpler algorithms and use the statistical properties or the emergent properties of the data to sort of compensate for the fact that our algorithms are getting simpler? And then the other thing that I'm trying to do here is also see if we can get by with smaller data sets to begin with. Because if we can actually reduce the data set, then that should help us as well. And that's what the talk is primarily about. So let's talk a little bit about set functions. So, I mean, data you can sort of think of as a set of objects. And choosing a subset of the data chooses a subset of the sets of objects. And so you might have, for example, like a set of objects which is represented by this variable v. So v is this set of objects which might consist of sushi, or trees, or insects, or scientific instruments like microscopes, and so on and so forth. And we have a set function, f, that evaluates subsets. Like, for example, the whole set itself, v, might have value 6. Right? If we take a subset of the set of items, like all of the pieces of sushi, we might, this function, f, might give that subset a. So like the idea is that this is a here. That might give that subset a value 1. And maybe some other subset. This is some other subset which consists of one tree, one piece of sushi, one butterfly. That might have valuation 6 again, say. So the point is that set functions are functions that provide a real number for every possible subset. So in the richest of cases, set functions have 2 to the n possible real numbers for every possible subset. Now, from amongst the set functions, we're defining a subset of these classes of functions, a class of submodular functions, if the following is true. So a submodular function is defined as a function, as a set function, such that for any a and b, for any subsets a and b, it has to be the case that this inequality holds true. Now that inequality is typically not seen as the most intuitive version, and there's an equivalent, mathematically equivalent definition of submodularity, which is the one at the bottom. And this says that if you take 2 subsets, a and b, one of which is a subset of the other, so b is a superset of a, and you take some item v, which is not in b, so v is then therefore not in a, then the valuation of v in the context of a, which is this. So this is, for example, like if you have a and you add v, how much does the value increase? That's that bit. That can be no less than the valuation in the larger context b. So basically, the more you have, the less valuable becomes anything that you don't have. That's the idea of diminishing returns. And that is sufficient to define, to render your function submodular. So submodular functions have a lot of attractive properties. But before we do this, let's make sure that the intuition is clear. So there's a question there.
The top definition also makes sense in the infinite case?
You could define it in infinite sets, yeah, as well. Or uncountable sets even. But I mean, actually, in the uncountable case, it becomes very similar to concavity. So Because this definition actually, if you were to go into a little more detail, this is actually very similar to sort of a negativity of a second derivative. So just intuitively, like if you had an urn with a number of balls in it, and each ball has one color, and you want to evaluate each urn, and the value of each urn is basically the number of different colors of the balls in the urn. Not the number of balls. You can have as many balls as you want. You won't increase the value of the urn unless you add a diversity of colors. And diminishing returns says that if you add say on the left-hand side, you add the blue ball here, you're basically going to increase the value, but you will only, if you have a larger context, the only possible thing that could happen is that you can render adding that blue ball to the urn ineffective or non-changing, because in the right-hand case, you already have blue balls in the urn. So therefore, you don't increase the value. You don't increase the diversity of the number of colors in the urn. So that's an example of a submodular function. Now, so what does submodularity buy us? So what I'm going to try to do is argue that on the one hand, submodularity offers lots of computational benefits. And secondly, submodularity also offers lots of, it's a natural class of functions to sort of measure information in data sets. So let's talk about the computational properties first. So the first thing is like you might want to say, use this function for doing a form of optimization. Like you want to minimize the submodular function unconstrainedly, namely find the subset of V that has smallest value, or maximize the submodular function. And it's pretty easy to show that if you know nothing about F, you can sort of hide the minimum anywhere in this vast ocean of subsets and make it such that it has value unboundedly below any of the undervalues. And so therefore, you can't even approximate this without an exponential cost solution. But on the other hand, if the function is submodular, then suddenly the left-hand side problem becomes polynomial time solvable, even though there's an exponential number of possible subsets, and the right-hand side problem becomes low-order polynomial time constant factor approximable, meaning that you can get really good solutions really cheaply. Not the perfect solution, but you can get really good solutions. So that, on the left-hand side for minimization, polytime is exact. You get the exact solution in polytime. The right-hand side, you get the approximate solution, which is the 0.63 guarantee, 1 minus 1 over e guarantee of the optimal solution. So it's pretty good, and it's independent of the size of V. So it's sort of a constant factor approximation guarantee. Now, oftentimes, you might be interested in constrained sets. So like, what constrained means is that you are interested only in a subset of the set of subsets. So let's say script S is a subset of 2 to the V. 2 to the V is the power set, right? So you're only interested in the subset of the set of subsets. And there are a number of different possible types of constraints you might want, like, for example, cardinality constraints. Let's say that you only care about sets that are no more than a particular size, or maybe you care about sets that are no more than a particular cost. B might be your budget, and W might be your cost vector. Or alternatively, you might be interested in constraints corresponding to combinatorial objects. So combinatorial objects might be defined via a graph. So a graph is at the center. And the types of constraints we might care about might be, we want either the subsets to be trees of the graph, or paths of the graph, or matchings, or vertex or edge covers, or cuts in the graph. Or alternatively, sets might be actual level sets. So you might have some other submodular function or some other function here. Like you might care about all sets whose valuation given by another function g is no more than alpha, or no less than alpha. So there are a variety of different kinds of constraints. Now again, this leads to sort of a discrete constrained optimization problem or set of problems, either by minimizing or maximizing, subject to the set of feasible constraints. And again, if you know nothing about the functions f and g, then this is hopelessly an intractable problem and hopelessly inapproximable problem. But when the function is submodular, suddenly everything becomes approximable. And sometimes the algorithms for, like, you do get approximation guarantees are very, very efficient and scalable to very, very large data sizes. OK, so we've got now computational niceness in this class of functions, submodularity. Now what we want to do is argue for applications niceness. So another question.
Do you also need assumptions in the structure of S, the subset of subsets?
I mean, the assumptions are usually these different kinds of constraints. So all of these types of constraints, either the cardinality, the knapsack, the combinatorial, or the level set constraints, are ones, and that spans a fairly rich set. There's a couple of others. There's like
level sets you can do like anything, but if you restricted the structure of G, then it would make things nicer, right?
yeah. So G is usually structured. So typically, like the case for which has approximation guarantees is when G is submodular. But there are a couple of others that I didn't mention for which there are also submodular. There are also guarantees like matroid independent set constraints or sublattice constraints, like for different kinds of distributed lattices. There are other kinds of constraints that you can actually put. Obviously, if you had arbitrary constraints, like if you took a random set of subsets, that wouldn't be tenable. So you're obviously using the structure of the constraints. And each type of algorithm is different. But the point is that there is some hope for doing something that offers you an insurance policy that what your algorithm is going to do is not so bad. So you could call me an insurance salesman, right? So, okay, so the question is, like, for example, let's now look at the idea of summarization. So could I just have a show of hands? So raise your hands if you've heard of the entropy function. Good, okay, very good. So entropy function is defined. So this is a slightly different way of defining the entropy function. We have a set V of random variables. And we're measuring the entropy of the subset of the random variables. So A is the index set of a set of random variables. And we're measuring the entropy. This is the definition of the entropy, but just over that marginal, over the set A of random variables. Now, and you're starting from this joint distribution over all V random variables. V is the set of random variables. Again, if this isn't clear, V is the set of indices of the random variables. OK, so in Shannon's classic 1948 paper, where he sort of was the first to sort of introduce the idea of entropy as an information function, mentioned that entropy is a subadditive function in this fashion. So that the entropy of a set A of random variables plus the entropy of a set B is less than or equal to the entropy of the set of random variables corresponding to the union of the sets. And then in 1954, McGill, who's another information theorist, who's very, very well known also, sort of showed in his paper that this is true of the entropy function here. He, by the way, actually attributed it to Shannon, although it's not in Shannon's paper. A simple anecdote, historical anecdote there. It turns out that second inequality is identical to the submodular inequality. Now, what they both did subsequently was to argue that thing that I just circled in red, that is sort of the natural property that an information function should have. Now, what do I mean by an information function? So the entropy function, which it sounds like a lot of you know, is an information function from the perspective of it measures the least number of bits you can represent a source that's drawn from a random distribution losslessly. So like, if you use fewer than bits, you're going to get errors. You can't compress something below the entropy. And so that's a reasonable definition of information, because like it's the most compressed form, it's the most compact form. But on the other hand, they said that this property down here, this thing which I said is identical to submodularity, also they said this is sort of a very natural property of information functions. And so entropy is great then as an information function. Also, entropy is a submodular function. So we might think, well, we could actually use information. We could use entropy. Like let's say we choose a subset of random variables that preserves all of the entropy of the whole set of random variables, or preserves as much as possible of the entropy as the whole set of random variables. That basically means that we've chosen a set of random variables that have lost none of the information of the full set. But this is problematic for one reason is that data items like pictures or database records or genes aren't random variables. These are just data items. These are just records in a database are not random variables. And then secondly, querying the entropy function itself costs exponential time just to do this inference, because you have to sum over an exponential number of terms here. So that's infeasible. But on the other hand, there are many diverse submodular functions. There are set cover functions and vertex cover functions and edge cover and bipartite neighborhoods, things like facility locations, things that have been used for many years in operations research. Sums of weighted concave over modular functions composed of modular functions. And I'm getting a text in my own talk, so I should turn that off. Should I answer that text? So, matrix rank functions. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, we're not going to. If you have questions about this, you can ask me. But I mean, there's a huge range of very useful, practical, and easy to evaluate submodular functions that, because they satisfy the submodular inequality, can be interpreted as information functions. Yet at the same time, they don't have the problems that entropy has, namely the fact that you can't evaluate it and the fact that you need random variables to actually evaluate it. And in fact, you can define notions of combinatorial independence using any submodular function. You can say that subset A and subset B are combinatorially independent if that equality is true, that I just highlighted it in yellow. Or you can say that subset A and subset B are conditionally independent given subset C if the following inequality is true. These, by the way, actually turn out to be identical to the definitions of independence and conditionally independence of random variables when the function f is the entropy function. But when they're submodular, that gives you sort of a different notion of independence. So you can now start talking about things like summarizing data sets that preserves the information. Right? So if it's an information function, you have a very large data set. You instantiate a submodular function over a large data set. You choose a subset that has high value. That means that you've preserved as much of, if it's a very high value, if it's guaranteed high value, you've preserved a significant portion of the information as measured by the submodular function on the original data set. Does everybody get the idea? OK, so in general, I mean, submodular functions are becoming very popular in machine learning. And they're used for a variety of reasons, like when you want to measure things like diversity or coverage or span or irredundancy, these sorts of things, you typically want to maximize the submodular function. And we're going to be primarily talking about applications that use submodular maximization today. But also, they're useful for a variety of problems like, for example, cooperative costs or shared fixed costs or complexity, roughness, and so on and so forth. And that's typically the case when you take a submodular function and you want to minimize it. Okay? But we're primarily going to stay here. Okay? So the approach then to big data summarization is to do the following. So we're given a large set of data items, V, and we find a good function, f, that represents the information that might be an entropy function or might be something else. And then so the question is, how do we obtain such a function? Well, one way would be to design it by hand. Oftentimes, when you are in a particular data domain, like if you're in functional genomics, you might know something about the way that genes are, and therefore define a function that's sort of good at expressing the information in a set of genes. Or you might automatically, alternatively, learn f based on some aspects of the data that you've got. And so what we're going to report in the below is both aspects. OK, another good time for asking questions, if there are any. OK, that means that everybody understood everything, right? So good. Oh, good. So sorry, that means that nobody understood anything. So. No, sorry.
We're using symbolic regression to find good f's.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Using symbolic regression to find good f's.
Using symbolic regression to find good f's?
Yes. Basically generating formula and then evaluating the
In some sense, that's the idea. That's right. Like it's the idea of machine learning. It could be some sort of regression, or maybe a symbolic regression, is that you have data and you have something that is adjusted to sort of explain the data well in some way. We're explaining how the notion of explaining is something that needs to be defined. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we do this in this case. Like, what does it mean to learn a submodular function? So the first application we actually tried this idea to was document summarization. So document summarization is a problem where, I think this is a problem that hits home for all of us. We're faced with a huge number of books and papers and articles and newspaper articles and magazine articles and journal papers to read. And oftentimes, they're quite redundant. And we would love to have a summary which sort of offers a synopsis of what is occurring in this large collection, yet at the same time loses no information. So you can save time. And so extractive document summarization is a problem where you have a large collection of documents and you extract out sentences from this large collection of documents that in some way or another represents the large collection. And then to argue why submodularity is a reasonable model, let's use the following figure. So on the left-hand side, let's say that the green is a summary, and you're considering adding the blue guy here to this summary. On the right-hand side, the green is the summary here, but you actually have a new sentence. This sentence here is now part of the summary, this bit here. So I'm not going to leave that there. And you're considering how much additional information about the large collection of documents would the blue sentence on the right-hand side add versus how much it would add, how much the blue sentence would add on the left-hand side. And when you think about it, like take the extreme case, like the very, very last sentence, not last in position, but let's say that you extract one sentence from a large collection of documents. That one sentence is probably not going to add any value, no matter what sentence that is. You can probably still get the gist of the article if you remove any one sentence. And even so, if you remove any two sentences. But on the other hand, it's the case that the information decreases as you remove more sentences, which is sort of like the reverse of submodularity. But this is, it's exactly submodularity, because this basically says that as the set of sentences you have grows, the value of any sentence you don't yet have diminishes. Those diminishing returns. So it turns out that when we looked at the literature, the literature of documentation goes back maybe 20 years, actually. So when we looked at the literature, there were many, many approaches, heuristic approaches for doing document summarization. And it turns out that many of them turned out to be inadvertently submodular approaches. They would define an objective that was submodular, but optimize it using sort of general purpose integer linear programming, without realizing that because the objective was submodular, you get these tractable, scalable, guaranteed approximate algorithms that I talked about a little bit earlier. So we then approached the problem strictly from a submodular point of view. And in fact, we sort of addressed this by learning submodular functions, where we learned a mixture of submodular functions. So it turns out that taking weighted sums of submodular functions where all of the weights are non-negative preserves submodularity. And that's represented by this quantity here. And this stuff here, for those of you who are familiar with max margin learning, it's basically a max margin learning objective to optimize the mixture weights. And it has two components. It's a regularizer, where you want the weights to be small, and a loss function, where these are the errors. Size are like the errors. And the errors sort of bound the difference between, say, the true valuation and some inferred evaluation. Okay. So this is an objective. It's a convex objective. We can actually learn it. We can do this for learning. And when we do this, we actually get quite nice results. So in fact, these are, I should mention a little bit about what DUC is. So DUC is the Document Understanding Corpus, which is a standard set of corpora that were defined by NIST for doing document summarization. And this is one of those corpora. We have results for a lot of the others, but I didn't have time to include them in the talk. And there's a standard way of evaluating a given summary that people have been using for years called Rouge. And these are our results. So our results were that in 2011, before we actually did any learning, we just sort of naively applied submodularity to this problem. We were getting already significantly better results. And then when we did this learning approach, which I just described, the results still got better. So it seems like, and that sort of, when we did that, we sort of thought, oh, well, this seems like submodularity should, because of the tractability and the naturalness, seems like something we could do for other kinds of data as well. So we started looking at problems in data summarization. So data summarization is the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, did the form of the regularization impact the effectiveness of the learning? Like, it looks like you're using L2.
Yeah.
Was it sensitive to that, or did
Well, that's a really good question. So there would be some benefit for doing like sparse regularization, like L1 regularization. The reason being that what we would ideally like to have is, because it's a mixture of submodular functions, once we're all done, we'd like to have only a small set of these components. We did try it once, but it didn't seem to do any better or any worse. I think the L2 did a little bit better, but to be honest, it was more along the lines of we didn't pursue that much further. But I think that would be I think that should be done more seriously. Yeah, you're on?
Are there any guarantees that you get from the learning? So when you're, so you have this objective, so you have this objective for learning the weights.
Yeah.
Then do you know how that translates to the guarantees that you have on learning the actual function?
Yeah, it's also a very good question. So this is very different kind of learning than like what's done in Nina Balkin and Nick Harvey's kind of stuff, where they actually they have a very different learning paradigm, where they have a distribution over subsets, and that what they're interested in doing is learning a function everywhere, based on only having samples at a set of subsets. Here, interestingly enough, what we're only doing is we're only learning based on subset valuations that are known to be large. So we're not actually trying to learn the function everywhere else. In fact, we would be perfectly happy if what happens is for all subsets that are larger than the set of subsets that we care about, the function saturates. And so the distortion between the true function and the one we learned is quite big. We'd be perfectly happy with that because we're never interested in subsets that are larger than a particular size. So I think the guarantee that we offer then therefore no guarantees with regard to like these other kind of guarantees, like being close everywhere. But I think on the other hand, there might be something that you could show for values that are less than the set of summaries that we actually trained on. But that's still open. So that's not a known question, but that's a good question. Any other questions? OK, let's move on to data summarization. So data summarization is the idea of the following. So we are doing machine learning. We have these massive training data sets, like, for example, lately, deep neural networks have been very popular in the machine learning community, but they're very, very difficult to train. Sometimes they take weeks or months to train, even when you have large computational resources. And so what we'd like to do here is to take a subset of the training data and train only on that subset and not lose too much. Don't lose too much fidelity. So we looked at this in 3 different settings. One was based on speech recognition, the speech recognition setting. The other is as statistical machine translation. I guess you can't really see that here, but they're all here. And the third is handwriting digit recognition. I'll just go through all of them. So the first thing to note is that there's the old adage, there's no data like more data. But in fact, when you actually look at the way that the performance grows as a function of increasing data, typically what you see is something that maybe could be better called more data is like no data. And the reason more data is like no data is because of learning curves, which are quite typical. So learning curves are, there's 2 axes. There's training set size, how much training data you have, and the resulting performance of your learning system. And they pretty much always have this kind of shape. And there's 2 reasons for having this kind of shape. One reason is that whenever you have a non-parametric, when you have sort of like a fixed learning system, a learning system that cannot grow and blossom to the complexity that exists in the data, at some point what happens is that the learning system itself fails to be able to learn anymore. It's itself reached capacity. But the other reason why you see this is because there's inherent redundancy in the data. People, when they collect data, generally aren't able to coordinate at data collection time the removal of redundancy. When you have sensors all around an environment, these little, especially sensors are usually pretty cheap. They're usually computationally cheap devices. Sensors cannot communicate with all the other sensors in the environment at the time that they're collecting and say, oh, this packet, I'm not going to send this off to the server because I know that I'm sensor number 3 and sensor number 7,647 has the same information. That just can't happen. And so what you end up getting is at the server side, where all the data is collected, you get massive redundancy. And this is true for most types of data sets. And in fact, this kind of property, this sort of learning curve property, this curved concave-like shape, seems to be ubiquitous. So there are lots of examples of this in speech recognition here, and machine translation, and just generic classification, and co-reference resolution. And this is some stuff that Daphne Kohler did. And there's lots of just other instances of this kind of thing that appears in the literature all over the place, these kind of curves. And so our research question is whether or not we can sort of mitigate this effect to some extent by choosing a subset of the data and sort of have it go up faster before it reaches the saturation point so that we're not faced with the redundancy issue. And so for speech recognition, we did this for 3 different settings, like I said. So for speech recognition where, again, we just want to choose a subset of speech utterances and train only on that. And I guess I'll just show you some results. I mean, so this is a sort of a standard speech recognition database called Switchboard, which is considered sort of one of the challenging tasks in the area of speech recognition. It's large vocabulary. It's it's very, very fluent speech. It's not isolated words. People just having casual conversations to each other. And this is showing a percentage of the full training data set, so 1 to 20% versus all of the data set. And this is, and the first upper table is showing this table here shows one type of speech recognition model, and this shows another type of speech recognition model. The upper one shows what would happen if you were to take random subsets, so a sampling-based approach. This row corresponds to a method that has been used in the past, which is a non-submodular method called histogram entropy, and has previously been considered state-of-the-art, developed by some folks at CMU. And then the bottom method corresponds to a submodular function variant. And then you get the same pattern at the bottom for a different model. I should mention that the bottom one is one that uses deep neural networks. The upper one uses Gaussian mixture models. And you can see that in each case, the submodular subselected data is appreciably better, significantly statistically better than the other ones. And in fact, what's interesting is that when you compare, what I think is a nice data point to compare is 10% of the data using this system is better than all of the data of the system, all the data in this system, despite the fact that this is a factor of 10 speed up on training time because you have only 1/10 of the amount of data. So that's potentially a useful result, a practical result. OK, so the next domain is in machine translation, which is an important problem these days, where one wants to translate strings from one language to another language. And this is a very common problem in machine translation, where you have a collection of training data which is very mixed domain. So like you might have European parliamentary discussions, as well as maybe casual conversations between people, and other sort of pub conversations down when people are drinking beer, all between, say, English and French. Yet now what you want to translate is a camera manual, say, from English to French. So the domain of the training data is mixed, whereas the domain of the test data is very specific. And so what typically one wants to do, and this is done quite typically in the statistical machine translation community, is you choose a subset of the training data that on the one hand is representative of the training data, but also matches the domain of the test data. And you only have one side of the test data, like, for example, the English side. Now, there are many previous approaches to this. And again, very similar to document summarization. After we looked at the literature, we found that they were also unintentionally and unknowingly reinventing submodularity, which to us seems like that is further evidence that this is a natural setting. This is a natural paradigm for this kind of problem. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the results. I mean, well, let me just briefly say, we used a class of submodular functions that's particularly useful for this problem because they're easy to evaluate, easy to learn, and easy to adjust based on differences in the data. And based on a number of previous, so this again is the random result. So these are blue scores, by the way, so higher is better. And taking a random subset, you get this. NIST and Europarl are two completely separate instances of this problem. Cross entropy was another state-of-the-art baseline. And then we have two submodular approaches. The bottom one is the one that worked the best in terms of producing the best scores. And you might say, well, are these scores significantly different? I mean, so this is always the case when you are from an area not in, say, statistical machine translation and you see differences in scores. It turns out that these score differences are actually quite appreciable in overall translation quality, even though the numeric value of the difference of the scores may not seem too large. OK, so then another domain we apply this to is handwritten digit recognition. So here, the idea is we want to train a classifier to learn to recognize handwritten digits accurately. And we used a standard image data set, which is called MNIST, which was actually developed in the late 90s by Jan LeCun. And we also used state-of-the-art classifiers, deep neural networks, where we wanted to show that summarization can even benefit the most recent state-of-the-art classification methods. And these are the results. So again, this is the number of data points. This is the error rate. The yellow line I'm about to draw, or what's the black line in the original figure, that corresponds to just random subset selection. And you can see that the variance, the variance is such that even the best cases out of a number of random subsets doesn't beat these sort of more intelligent methods. And let me just highlight one other point. So this, I don't know if you can see this point, but this light blue here, which is underneath the yellow that I'm just drawing, that corresponds to a previous state-of-the-art method in this domain, which is called uncertainty sampling. And the basic idea here, this is actually a form of active learning, by the way. And active learning is where you take a certain amount of unlabeled data, you label it, train a system on those labels, look at the uncertainty over the remaining unlabeled data samples, label the most uncertain samples, the ones that you're least certain about, train a new system on the union of the labeled data, and then you repeat that whole process repeatedly as the data set grows. And the difference between uncertainty sampling and the submodular methods below, which did the best, is based on, is this amount. And so sometimes there's quite a significant difference, like a 2 absolute percentage point difference. And the way that worked is, again, it's a form of active learning, but it uses a submodular objective to judge the diversity of the points. So we don't just want points that the current classifier is uncertain about. We want to take a diverse subset of points that the current classifier is uncertain about. And that significantly improves the results. So it's, again, the same kind of paradigm. OK. Oh, yep. 5 minutes. OK. Is that a question? OK. I'll take that as a question. What's the answer? All right, so there's 2 other domains. Image summarization is something I think that's all important to us. And so this is an example of the number of images that I took of my then 4-year-old son. There was about 5,000 images. So I took about a little more than 1,000 images per year. And the problem is, and we're all faced with this, we have a massive number of images on our smartphones and our computers, but we want to choose a representative subset of them. And so there are a lot of reasons for doing this. I mean, you could imagine, for example, choosing a summary of images because you want to come up with a cover. Let's say you want to develop a 3D model of some object, and you want to make sure that you have a cover of everything, and you want to remove the redundancy. Or you just want to show the set of images to your friend or your parent or something. Or video frame summarization. YouTube is using this a lot these days. For example, like when you actually flash a couple of frames of the video, you want to make sure that the frames that are flashed are diverse, that they're not redundant. Because otherwise, they're not giving you as much information about the video as you could if they were diverse. So one of the things that we wanted to do here was be able to train a submodular function again. And so we actually had to undergo this massive data set, this training data set collection effort, where we went to Amazon Turk, and we asked the Turkers to summarize image collections of where the image collections were size 100. And in fact, we actually had 14 image collections, each of which had 100 images, and we asked them to produce good summaries. And so we ended up getting about 5,500 summaries of those 14 image collections in total, which was sufficient to learn. And you can see, for example, like here's an image collection here on the left, and here's some summaries. Like these are good summaries on like each row is a summary. These are good. Each row is a good summary. It's a size 10 summary because there's no redundancy. Whereas if we take these bottom ones, these are pretty bad summaries. I think for people in Boston, this is a particularly bad summary, right? So that's like the nightmare summary for you. So, well, the best case scenario, maybe you would want, like if it was pictures of Hawaii, you would want a redundant summary with only sunny beaches, cloudless skies and beaches, right? So maybe redundancy is relative. But the typical results, again, we learned a submodular function, and we were able to sort of find that the learned submodular function produced very, very good summaries. This plot actually shows us slightly out-of-date results, but this is sort of like the max of the learned mixture. In our most recent results, this thing is shifted to the right. It's just that the picture's a little bit out of date. But in fact, what we're achieving now is that our learned summarization function is as good as the average human. And we're working to try to improve it to be better than the average human. OK, so this is sort of becoming, I think, a sort of a recognizable pattern of what we're doing. We're finding data sets, summarizing them, and seeing how well it can work. This is each one of these cases requires a lot of domain-specific knowledge for it to work, I should mention. But they all also rest on submodularity, without which none of this would work. The last example of this is in functional genomics. And the idea of functional genomics, I'm sure some of you know this better than I do, but the idea is that you want to understand better how genes function. And there are lots of ways in which genes function throughout the genome. And one way of measuring that is to look at and to measure experimental assays along the gene in different cells, specific cells. And the way that the different assays behave is different for the different cell types. And typically, one would wish for all cell types to have all assays run, but they're very, very expensive. And in fact, because they're expensive, you end up having this, like this table here, which is a collection of indicators of cell type assay existences, which is very, very sparse. But it's sparse in a fairly arbitrary way. There was no method to the madness of this sparsity. What we would like to do instead is, for example, identify the assays that, if we had them, would let us infer everything else, or as much as possible, about the remaining assays that we didn't actually run, to reduce cost while preserving information, or retaining as much information about the function of the gene. So this is very, very new results. In fact, this is you are the first people to see this. But basically, we have some preliminary results where we developed a number of different ways of measuring the summary. The arrows, by the way, the red arrows indicate whether or not higher is better or lower is better. So in the first row, higher is better. The second row, lower is better. But in each case, we can see that in using submodular methods for doing the summarization, we're able to obtain summarizations of genomic assays that perform significantly better than the averaged or even the best of a set of random instances, which is essentially what this figure shows, which are the assays that exist, and are beginning to approach the information that you'd get from the whole data set. And I don't have the time to explain all these different evaluation methods. In fact, part of this research actually was figuring out precisely how best to evaluate the quality of a summary of assays. But that is something you can either ask in question or we can talk about some other time. So in any event, that's the end of the talk. I think to sort of summarize what we've done, we've talked about, and again, you can't see this here, we've talked about large data sets and how big data is different data. And we're interested in trying to extract summaries of the big data. And can the summaries of the big data preserve the properties, the nice properties that big data affords? And then we've argued that submodular functions are natural for this. They're computationally useful. They're informationally useful. And they seem to work on a plethora of diverse different data sets. So I would also, of course, be remiss if I did not acknowledge the following amazing people. These are former or current students or current colleagues. So all these people are great. And I think, why don't I just leave that up here for a second so you can read everybody's names. Yeah, question?
Yeah, so most of the talk, you were talking about large data sets that exist and wanting to take subsets. But
Yeah.
This last example was about saving costs by not having to measure everything in the first place.
Yeah.
But of course, like if you haven't measured anything, then there's nothing to apply methods to.
Yeah.
Will tell you what to
That's
measure.
right.
So when you did that, for example, gene functionality, I mean, what's the kind of, were you starting with that data that sort of existed by historical record, what people had chosen to do?
Yeah.
And then how would you approach a problem where there isn't much to go on yet?
Well, one way of doing it would be, I mean, the idea, of course, is that you want generalization. Right? In all these cases, you want generalization. And in fact, a lot of the submodular methods, like we actually learned submodular functions on one set of images and applied them to another set of images. In the genomic assay case, we didn't actually do the learning because we don't have the training data. But there, the hope would be that you could generate you could generalize across individual or maybe across species, so that you find the assays which are useful based on one person who perhaps is, has a large number of their assays obtained, such that you could then only run a small number of them for somebody else, or across species. And so that's something that we're looking at. So.
Let's pause for a second. Just to thank John for his talk.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe just a couple of questions.
Yep.
The example you have about
So entropy is a submodular function. But entropy is not sort of a practical submodular function. Entropy is not a function that we can actually use for the two reasons of entropy is computationally difficult to deal with, and data items are not random variables.
So which submodular function are you using?
Yeah, no, I didn't really talk a lot about the specific submodular functions. So there's a large set of submodular functions that we drew from. I mean, the thing that is most attractive about the learning submodular functions is that you can start with a very, very large collection of them. And especially the question about, like, for example, the L0, the L1 penalty, it would choose a subset of the submodular functions that when mixed together would provide you with some mixture of them. So you sort of don't need to decide that if you're learning them. But on the other hand, in cases where learning is not possible because you don't have the training data, you just have to sort of design them by hand.
So let's take one more question if anyone has one. So the example you showed, if I understood this correctly, the example you showed of trying to find the different pictures that kind of represented a particular event or something like that, that's in some sense a sort of like unsupervised notion of pictures, right? You're not putting in any notion of, I want all pictures that are, say, either loving or sexy or whatever. There's no labeling of those.
That's right.
It's just a maximally entropic, if you like,
Yep.
set of pictures. So if you wanted to build in some more supervision into the problem, would you just do that via your regularization?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's also a very good question. So I think, one of the things I didn't talk about is that within the paradigm of submodular optimization strategies, there's one that allows us, for example, to have essentially, say, like query images. Like, let's say that you have a picture of your, friend or something, and you want to find all friends that sort of are like, all pictures that are like this picture of my friend. So it's called the submodular span problem, and essentially what we do is we condition on that image, give me all images that are sort of representative of that, and then summarize that set. So you can do, and also sort of more amorphous, sort of not really well-defined qualitative queries like love or passion or sultriness. You could also, if one could sort of just define that based on you selecting the image, because you're the one who sort of has that idea. You don't even have to quantify that, but you sort of condition on that set of images, and it would find those sets that are similar to that, but summarize the set that are similar to that. So yeah, query-based summarization. In fact, for the document summarization, that was query-based, by the way. Web search, in some sense, is like query-based summarization, because essentially what web search is doing is, in response to a web search query, it gives you back a summary of the entire web, right? So that is not dissimilar, right? Although here, for images, I mean, we have the ability to use submodularity and sort of to do learning and that kind of thing.
I guess